A young billionaire spots a homeless boy asleep on the sidewalk in New York City, but when the kid wakes up and says, "I dreamed about you. Your future is in danger," what happens next is truly chilling. The champagne bubbled in crystal flutes while the orchestra played at a discreet volume. Paul Moreau adjusted his bow tie and observed the grand ballroom filled with important people. Bright smiles, sparkling jewelry, conversations about business, politics, and the latest investments. Everything exactly as it should be. After all, the annual Entrepreneurs Gala in New York was the most anticipated event of the year. "Congratulations on the deal, Paul," said Jack Beaumont, patting him on the shoulder. $50 million for Moreau Enterprises. Who would have thought that little software company would go this far? Paul forced a smile, nodding his head. Indeed, who would have thought? Not even he, 30 years ago, imagined his life would take this turn. "Thank you, Jack. It's not finalized yet, but things look promising. And your retirement plans? Are you finally going to buy that yacht you always wanted?" The question hung in the air. Paul took a sip of champagne to gain time. A yacht, a house in the Hamptons, trips around the world. That was the full package, wasn't it? The dream everyone there shared. "I'm still thinking about the possibilities," he answered vaguely. Jack was called over by another guest, and Paul seized the chance to slip away. He walked to one of the huge windows overlooking the city lights. New York at night was a spectacle, with the Hudson River reflecting the bright points of light like a broken mirror. Paul looked at his reflection in the glass. A 58-year-old man, carefully trimmed grey hair, an impeccably tailored suit, and a face that still held a bit of youth despite the lines time had drawn. A successful man, as everyone there liked to say. So why couldn't he shake off that feeling of emptiness? His phone vibrated. It was an email from Thomas Laurent, his partner for over 20 years, with the latest updates on the company's sale. "Everything proceeding as planned," the message read. "Swiss Tech is preparing the final paperwork." Another confirmation that his professional life was perfect. The company he had built from scratch was about to be sold for an amount that would ensure comfort for the rest of his days. The biggest deal of his life. Paul put his phone away and looked at his watch. Nearly midnight. The party would go on for a few more hours, but he had already done his social part. He had greeted the important investors, exchanged friendly words with competitors, and been photographed by business magazine journalists. His presence was no longer required. He quietly said goodbye to a few closer acquaintances and made his way to the hotel lobby. The receptionist called a cab, but Paul waved it off. "It's a nice night. I'll walk for a bit." The fresh October air greeted him as he stepped outside. The temperature was mild for that time of year, and the sidewalks were not as empty as he'd expected. Small groups of tourists were still snapping pictures of historic buildings, and a few couples were leaving restaurants arm in arm. Paul loosened his bow tie as he walked unhurriedly. His apartment was about 20 minutes away, in one of New York's most exclusive neighborhoods. With each step he took, he felt the weight of the day fading, but not the emptiness that had settled in his chest for how long now? Years, maybe. The truth was too inconvenient to admit even to himself. Paul Moreau had everything money could buy, and none of what truly mattered. He had been without a wife for almost a decade, ever since Claire decided she could no longer handle being married to a workaholic. No children, something they had both postponed until it was too late. Friends. He had contacts, acquaintances, business partners, people who respected him for the value of his signature, not for the man he was. At some point, he had traded genuine connections for networking links, life stories for success stories, love for professional admiration. Paul stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change. Across the street, an elderly couple walked hand in hand, laughing at some private joke. Something about that simple scene made his chest tighten. That was what he lacked, someone to share the small joys, the accumulated memories, the comfortable silence. The light changed, and Paul crossed. He was now in a less busy area. The elegant storefronts had given way to more modest establishments, many already closed for the night. He usually didn't pass through there, but his aimless walk had taken him off his usual route. That was when he saw him, Under the awning of a closed store, a small shape huddled on pieces of cardboard. At first, Paul thought it was just a pile of blankets or abandoned bags, but as he got closer, he realized it was a child, a boy, no more than 6 or 7, slept curled up in a coat far too large for his frail body. Next to him, a worn backpack seemed to contain all his belongings. His face, partially visible, had delicate features, but the skin was pale and dirty. Paul froze, stunned by the scene. The contrast was too jarring. He was coming from an event where a single bottle of champagne cost about a month's rent, and here was a child sleeping on the street. A few yards away, a restaurant was closing its doors. Well-dressed employees walked out, laughing and talking, passing by the boy as if he were invisible. No one stopped. No one even looked. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement not to see what was right in front of them. Paul felt a wave of conflicting emotions: shock, pity, anger, helplessness. How was it possible, in the 21st century, in one of the most prosperous cities in America, for a child to be sleeping on the sidewalk? How could people just go on with their lives, ignoring that? And why had he never really noticed before? How can someone live like this? He muttered to himself, his voice almost inaudible. That was when it happened. As if he had heard Paul's words, the boy opened his eyes. It wasn't Paul's movements that woke him, nor any noise from the street. It was almost as if something had alerted him, a sixth sense that made him wake up at that exact moment. His eyes, an intense blue that contrasted with the dirt on his face, stared straight into Paul's. There was no fear in that gaze, nor the usual confusion of someone just waking up. It was a fully alert look, aware, and somehow too old for a child. Paul felt a chill. There was something in that gaze that completely disarmed him, made him feel exposed, as if the boy could see past his expensive suit and his facade of success. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The world around them seemed frozen. Then the boy spoke, in a clear voice that did not match his fragile appearance. "I dreamed about you. Your future is in danger." The words hit Paul like a punch. He took a step back, his mouth slightly open, not knowing how to react. His rational mind immediately sought explanations. The boy was probably confused. Maybe he had mental issues, or it was just an unusual tactic to get some spare change. "What?" he finally managed, his voice betraying his unease. The boy kept staring at him, not blinking. "You're going to lose everything. Not because of what you did, but because of what you failed to see." Paul felt his throat go dry. This was absurd, of course, completely irrational. He was letting himself be affected by the words of a homeless child, probably coached by some adult to manipulate strangers. He forced himself to regain his composure and walked off quickly, passing by the boy without looking back. Yet the echo of those words seemed to pursue him, blending with the sound of his hurried footsteps on the sidewalk. "Your future is in danger." Ridiculous, he thought. Pure coincidence that the boy had said something like that precisely when he was about to close the biggest deal of his life. It meant nothing. But as he neared his elegant building, complete with uniformed doorman and illuminated facade, Paul could not shake the sense of unease. The emptiness he had felt during the party had turned into something heavier, more urgent. He entered his apartment, spacious, meticulously decorated by a famous interior designer, and was greeted by familiar silence. He tossed his jacket over the leather sofa and went straight to the bar B, pouring himself a whiskey. The amber liquid burned his throat but did not ease his tension. Paul walked over to the panoramic window, which offered a privileged view of the city. Down below, New York carried on its nightlife, indifferent to his concerns. How many children like that were sleeping on the streets at this very moment? How many homeless people had he passed by without noticing all these years? It was strange how he had never really stopped to think about it before. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Thomas again. "Paul, sorry to call so late, but I just got a message from Swiss Tech. They want to move up the final meeting to the day after tomorrow. Apparently, another group is interested in buying." "Another group? I thought we had exclusivity." "We did, but something changed. I don't know the details yet, but it's not necessarily bad. It could even raise their offer." Paul nodded, although Thomas couldn't see him. "All right. We'll talk tomorrow at the office. Sure, how was the gala? Same as always, Paul replied. Nothing new? He hung up and looked back out the window. For some reason, the boy's words surfaced again in his mind, not because of what you did, but because of what you failed to see. What wasn't he seeing? Paul shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. He was just tired, letting himself be carried away by the melancholy that sometimes overcame him late at night. Tomorrow, in the light of day, everything would go back to normal. He would once again be Paul Moreau, the successful businessman about to close the biggest deal of his life. But as he got ready for bed, the image of those blue eyes still haunted him. And as hard as he tried, he could not rid himself of the sense that something important had changed that night, something that went far beyond meeting a homeless boy. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was restless and filled with confusing dreams in which he ran through corporate building mazes, chased by a shadow he could never see, while a child's voice echoed, "Your future is in danger." The alarm rang at 6 sharp, as it did every day. Paul opened his eyes, feeling the weight of a poorly slept night. He had tossed and turned for hours, pursued by uneasy dreams he couldn't fully remember upon waking. Only fragments lingered, a labyrinth, a pair of blue eyes, a sense of urgency. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face. His large, elegant bedroom caught the first rays of sunlight through the slightly open curtains. Everything was in perfect order, as always. There was no reason for the discomfort that had followed him since the night before. A homeless kid, that's all it was, he murmured to himself, getting up to begin his morning routine. Under the hot shower, Paul tried to organize his thoughts. Today would be a big day at Moreau Enterprises. The Swiss tech team would send the preliminary documents for the acquisition, and he needed to be alert to every detail. $50 million didn't just fall from the sky every day. He dressed with his usual care, a light blue shirt, a dark gray suit, a discreet tie. His reflection in the mirror was the same as ever, the successful businessman, confident, in control of everything. It was reassuring to see that on the outside, at least, nothing had changed. In the kitchen, he made a strong cup of coffee and grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl. He wasn't very hungry. As he ate, he checked his phone messages. Several work emails, a few social media notifications he rarely bothered with, and a text from Thomas. "Need to update you on Swiss tech news. Can we meet earlier at the office?" Paul replied affirmatively and finished his coffee. Picking up his car keys, he hesitated. Normally, he'd ask his driver to take him, but today he felt the need to drive himself. Perhaps having control of the steering wheel would help dispel the strange unease. Morning traffic in New York was relatively calm that day. Paul drove on autopilot, his body familiar with the route while his mind wandered. He passed the spot where he had seen the boy the night before, slowing instinctively. The awning was now empty. There was no sign of the child or his belongings. "I dreamed about you. Your future is in danger," the words returned, uncomfortably vivid. "Nonsense," he said aloud, pressing the accelerator again. He arrived at the Moreau Enterprises building 20 minutes later. The modern structure, its glass facade reflecting the cloudy sky, was a source of pride. Paul had personally worked with a renowned architect on its design 10 years ago, when the company began to grow exponentially. He parked in his reserved spot and greeted the security guard with a nod. In the elevator, he took a deep breath, preparing himself to play the familiar role everyone expected, the confident leader. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau," said Marie, his secretary, when he stepped off the elevator. "Mr. Laurent is already in your office. He said it's urgent." Paul frowned. Thomas was already there. That was unusual, given that his partner rarely arrived before 9. "Thank you, Marie. Any messages?" "Yes, your lawyer called. He asked you to call him back as soon as you arrived. He said it's important." Paul felt a pang of worry. Philippe Dubois, his personal attorney for nearly 20 years, wasn't one to cause unnecessary alarm. "I'll talk to Thomas first, then I'll return his call." He walked down the wide corridor, greeting employees who were already arriving. The place was buzzing with activity, everyone appearing focused and efficient. That was what he had always strived to build, a productive work environment that wasn't oppressive. Unlike many tech startups, Moreau Enterprises maintained a healthy balance between innovation and stability. Entering his office, he found Thomas looking out the panoramic window. His partner turned upon hearing the door, revealing deep circles under his eyes and a tense expression at odds with his usual optimism. "Paul, finally, I tried calling you earlier." "My phone was on silent," Paul lied. He had actually ignored some calls while driving, lost in thought. "What happened?" "You look like you haven't slept." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair, a nervous gesture Paul rarely saw. "It's Swiss Tech. I got a call last night, after I spoke with you. They want to renegotiate some terms of the deal." "Renegotiate? What time did they call?" "Around 2 in the morning. Apparently, they're in a different time zone and didn't care much about local hours," Thomas said with a shrug. "Anyway, the point is, they're asking for an additional clause that would give us less control over the transition of the team." Paul sat at his desk, trying to process this information. That's unusual at this stage of the negotiation. They had already agreed to the original terms. Exactly what I told them, but apparently something internal came up and made them reconsider. Paul was about to respond when his phone rang. It was Marie telling him Philippe was on the line. "Thomas, I need to take this call." "We'll continue this discussion in a moment." Thomas nodded and left the office, leaving Paul alone with his increasingly uneasy thoughts. He picked up the phone, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Philippe, good morning." "Paul, sorry to bother you so early, but we have a problem." Philippe's voice sounded tense, without his usual formalities. "I received the preliminary documents from Swiss Tech last night and spent the night reviewing them. There's something wrong." Paul felt a tightness in his stomach. "Define wrong." "There's a flaw in the documentation for the company's sale." Philippe paused, as though carefully choosing his next words. "Someone is trying to manipulate you, Paul." The lawyer's words struck Paul like a physical blow. Immediately, the image of the boy on the sidewalk flashed through his mind, with his intense blue eyes and clear voice. "Your future is in danger." "Explain," he managed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Some of the financial terms have been subtly altered. If you signed without noticing, you would lose control over the company's key patents. Additionally, there's a hidden clause between the lines that would allow Swiss Tech to completely restructure the company without warning, meaning they could fire the entire original team if they wanted." That makes no sense. Why would Swiss Tech risk the entire deal with such an obvious maneuver? That's exactly the point, Paul. I don't think it's coming from Swiss Tech. The formatting of these documents is slightly different from the earlier ones, and the digital signature shows discrepancies. I think someone intercepted the original documents and tampered with them before they reached us. Paul was silent for a few seconds, trying to digest the information. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them pleasant. "Do you have any suspicion of who could be behind this?" Philippe sighed on the other end of the line. "It would have to be someone with access to the original documents and enough knowledge of the operation to know exactly what to alter. Someone inside." Paul's stomach sank even further. Someone inside. The boy's words echoed. "Your future is in danger." "I'll investigate, Philippe. In the meantime, don't mention your suspicions to anyone, not even Thomas." "I want to verify a few things first." "Sure. I'll send you a detailed report of the changes I identified. Be careful, Paul. Whoever's doing this knows exactly what's at stake." After hanging up, Paul remained motionless in his chair, gazing at the New York skyline through his office window. The city seemed distant, as though he were observing it through a blurry lens. Philippe's words blended with the boy's cons, forming a warning he could no longer ignore. Paul checked his watch. 9:30. He had an executive board meeting at 11, just enough time to do what he needed. He grabbed his phone and jacket, then left his office in a hurry. "I'll be out for a few hours, Marie," he told his secretary. "If anyone asks, say I had a personal emergency." "Yes, sir. Should I inform Mr. Laurent?" Paul hesitated for a second. "No, I'll let him know later." He left the building and got into his car, feeling an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He drove through the streets of New York, retracing last night's route. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, but something pushed him forward, an intuition he couldn't explain. When he arrived at the spot where he had seen the boy, he parked and got out to look around. The area was busier in the daytime, with people rushing around paying no attention to him. The awning where the child had slept was empty, just as he'd noticed earlier. Paul walked the sidewalk carefully, observing nothing. Perhaps it really had been a coincidence, just a random encounter with a homeless kid, and his already anxious mind about the company sale had turned it into something more significant. He was about to give up when he spotted a small figure sitting on the steps of a church across the street. Even from a distance, he recognized that oversized coat and worn backpack. Paul hurried across, nearly getting hit by a cyclist who shouted at him in annoyance. As he approached, he saw it was indeed the same boy. In daylight, he looked even more fragile and younger than Paul had imagined. The child was eating a piece of bread, watching the pigeons gathering around him, hoping for crumbs. He seemed completely absorbed until he noticed Paul's presence. His eyes rose slowly, that same intense, unsettlingly observant blue. For a moment, neither spoke. Paul, a businessman used to leading meetings and impressing investors, suddenly had no idea what to say. The boy was the one who broke the silence. "You came back?" he said simply, without surprise in his voice, as if he'd been expecting him. Paul nodded, sitting a respectful distance away on the same step. "You told me something last night, about my future." The boy kept feeding the pigeons, but his eyes remained fixed on Paul. "My name is Ethan," he said, ignoring Paul's comment. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. I'm Paul." "I know who you are," Ethan responded, with a seriousness that seemed out of place in someone so young. "That's why I had the dream." Paul felt a shiver run through him. The coincidence was too unsettling. "What dream exactly?" Ethan finished his bread and wiped the crumbs from his hands onto his worn pants before answering. "It was strange. I didn't know you, had never seen you before. But in the dream, I knew it was you." He paused, frowning as if trying to remember key details. "I saw you crying alone. Everything you built was in ruins." But the betrayal came from someone close. The words hit Paul like a punch. They matched disturbingly well with what Philippe had said. "Someone inside, Paul." How do you know that?" he asked, unable to hide the disturbance in his voice. Ethan shrugged, a surprisingly adult gesture. "I just know sometimes I have dreams like that. My mom used to say it was a gift, but out here on the streets, people think I'm crazy." He looked at Paul with a disconcerting intensity. "Do you think I'm crazy?" "No," Paul answered, surprised by his own sincerity. "I don't think you're crazy, but I don't understand how this is possible." "I don't understand it either," Ethan admitted, "but I know it's true. Someone you trust is going to betray you if you're not careful." Paul felt the weight of those words. It was absurd to believe in a child's predictions, but the coincidences were too many to ignore. And now, with Philippe's warning, "How long have you been on the streets, Ethan?" The boy thought for a moment. "I'm not sure, since my dad disappeared." "It's been a long time. And your mom?" "She died when I was little," Ethan replied, his tone too neutral for such a painful subject. It was the tone of someone who had long accepted an irreparable loss. Paul felt a wave of compassion. He had problems, yes, but nothing compared to what this child had faced in such a short life. "Are you hungry?" he asked, realizing that tiny piece of bread was probably not enough. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. There was pride in his eyes, but also the practical acceptance of reality. "Let's get something to eat, and you can tell me more about this dream," Paul suggested, standing up. As they walked toward a nearby cafe, Paul couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's and Philippe's words. The betrayal came from someone close. Someone inside. Paul. Pieces were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing puzzle. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Thomas asking where he was, saying they urgently needed to discuss next steps with Swiss Tech. Thomas, his friend and partner for more than 20 years, the closest person he had. Paul looked at Ethan, who walked silently beside him, and felt a chill. The boy had come into his life like an unexpected messenger, and now, for the first time in a long while, Paul was truly afraid of what the future held. Paul sat in his home office, surrounded by piles of printed documents. It was nearly midnight, but sleep was nowhere near. His laptop displayed financial spreadsheets from Moreau Enterprises over the last 2 years, and beside it sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey, unusual for a man who rarely drank on weekdays. 3 days had passed since meeting Ethan and receiving Philippe's call. 3 days of suspicious glances, cautious conversations, and quiet investigations. Paul now saw his company, his creation, with new eyes. What was once his refuge had become a maze of secrets. He picked up his phone and reread Philippe's message. I managed to track the source of the alterations in the documents. They were made using internal company credentials. Anyone with executive-level access could be responsible. Paul sighed, taking another sip of his drink. The circle of suspects was small but painful to consider. Thomas Lawrence, his partner for 2 decades. Marie Fontaine, his secretary who knew every detail of his operations. Claude Renoir, the CFO who held all the company's numbers in his hands. A few other trusted executives who had helped build Moreau Enterprises from the beginning. Someone he trusted was behind this. Paul turned his attention back to the computer screen. He was reviewing quarterly financial reports, comparing them with raw data he had secretly requested from the accounting department. The discrepancies were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Small transfers to consultancy accounts, slightly inflated project expenses, rounded figures that, over time, added up to a considerable amount. How did I not notice this before, he murmured, rubbing his tired eyes. The answer was simple and uncomfortable: trust. He had delegated detailed financial oversight years ago, focusing on the broader vision and strategy. His leadership style had always been based on trust and autonomy. It had worked well until now. His phone rang. It was Thomas for the 3rd time that night. Paul let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to speak with his partner, not until he had more clarity about what was going on. That afternoon's meeting with Swiss Tech had been tense. Paul had rejected the tampered documents, citing legal inconsistencies that needed reviewing, without mentioning his real suspicions. The Swiss company's representative had seemed genuinely confused, insisting that the documents they had sent were correct. The situation reached a stalemate, with a promise of new paperwork in a few days. Thomas questioned his decision as soon as they left the meeting. "What's going on, Paul?" "We're risking the deal of our lives." Paul gave vague excuses about legal concerns, and Thomas didn't look convinced. The frustrated expression on his partner's face remained clear in his memory. Was it the look of a man genuinely worried about the company's future, or the mask of someone hiding his real intentions? A noise at the front door broke his train of thought. Paul froze, checking the time. Who would come to his home at that hour? He moved silently to the drawer of his desk and took out the small gun he kept for protection, something he never thought he'd actually use. Footsteps approached his office, and Paul aimed the gun at the door, heart pounding. The handle turned, and the door opened. "Paul?" It was the voice of Gabriel, his housekeeper, sounding surprised. "My God, what are you doing?" Paul immediately lowered the gun, both embarrassed and relieved. "Gabriel, I'm sorry. I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour." The middle-aged woman looked at him with maternal concern. "I forgot my scarf and came back to get it." "But are you all right?" Paul realized how disturbing the scene must appear. Him disheveled, drinking alone late at night, surrounded by papers, now brandishing a gun. "Yes, just too much work." "Go on home, Gabriel. It's late." After she left, Paul put the gun away and sat back down. His own reaction had scared him. In just a few days, he had gone from a confident businessman to a paranoid man, suspecting everyone around him. That thought brought him back to Ethan. The boy had vanished after their coffee meeting. Paul had taken him to a children's shelter, promising to come back the next day, but when he returned, they said Ethan had left during the night. No one knew where he was. Part of Paul felt relieved. The child was a constant reminder of something he preferred not to think about, that there was more to life than balance sheets and business deals, that kids slept on the streets while he hoarded millions. But another part missed the brutal honesty of those blue eyes. Paul closed the laptop. He needed professional help, someone from the outside who could analyze the situation objectively, not part of the company's circle of trust. The next morning, after a few hours of restless sleep, Paul drove to a discreet office in New York's commercial district. The building lacked the grandeur of Moreau Enterprises. It was an older, tastefully restored building, but without ostentation. Lucas Mercier greeted him in a spacious room overlooking the Hudson. A man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes, Lucas was one of the most respected forensic auditors in the country. He had worked on high-profile cases, uncovering complex corporate fraud through unconventional methods. "Mr. Moreau, it's an honor to meet you," Lucas said, indicating a chair. "Though I wish it were under different circumstances." Paul nodded as he sat. "I appreciate your discretion. As I mentioned over the phone, I need an independent and confidential analysis." "You'll get it," Lucas assured him. "Did you bring the documents I asked for?" Paul handed him a folder and a flash drive. "Here are the official financial reports from the last 2 years, along with raw data I collected separately. I've also included copies of the tampered sale documents and the original communications with Swiss Tech." Lucas quickly skimmed through the folder before speaking. "To be clear, you believe someone inside your company is embezzling funds and tried to manipulate the sale for personal gain?" "Exactly, and I need to know who be before confronting anyone." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concern. Powerful people don't like being investigated, especially when they have something to hide. I'll need a few days to go through all this." "How long, exactly?" "At least 3 days. I have some proprietary algorithms that can spot patterns in large volumes of financial data, but even the best tools can have trouble finding conclusive evidence in sophisticated fraud." Paul felt a twinge of frustration. "I need answers, Mr. Mercier. The company's sale is on the line, and so is the future of hundreds of employees." The auditor looked at him gravely. "I'll do my best to find them, but keep in mind whoever is doing this is smart and careful. That's how they've stayed hidden for so long." That observation hit Paul hard. For how long had this been happening right under his nose? What else had he missed while he was focused solely on big numbers and prestige? After leaving Lucas's office, Paul decided to drop by the company. Despite it being Saturday, he knew he would find a few people working, including Thomas Aichu, who always spent a few weekend hours getting ahead. Stepping into the Moreau Enterprises building, he greeted the weekend security guard and headed straight for his floor. The office was almost deserted, just a few programmers who preferred the quiet Saturday hours to code. Paul passed Thomas's office and noticed the door ajar, but no sign of his partner. He continued on to his own office, where he found Marie organizing some documents. "Mr. Moreau," she exclaimed, surprised. "I didn't expect you today." "I wanted to get a head start on a few things," he replied vaguely. "Is Thomas around?" "He was here earlier, but he left about an hour ago." "He said he had a personal appointment." Paul nodded, watching his secretary with renewed scrutiny. Marie had worked with him for almost 15 years, witnessing the entire journey. She knew every aspect of the company and had access to confidential information. Could she be involved? "Is something wrong?" Marie asked, noticing his prolonged look. "No, nothing. I'm just tired," Paul forced a smile. "I'm going to review some Swiss Tech documents. Could you give me some privacy?" Once Marie left, Paul sat at his desk and powered up his computer. Using his administrative login, he started going through the access logs for the company's shared folders. He wanted to see who had accessed the sale documents in the days before they were tampered with. The logs showed multiple accesses: Thomas, Marie, Claude, and other executives. Nothing conclusive. Paul then checked the external communications logs for any suspicious contact with Swiss Tech or other companies possibly involved. Again, nothing unusual. Frustrated, Paul was about to give up when he noticed something odd in Thomas's email records. There was a series of communications with an unidentified address using a temporary email server. The messages had been deleted from the system, but the logs still showed their existence. Paul's heart raced. This could be innocent. Thomas dealt with many sensitive contacts, but the timing coincided with the problems in the documentation and was unsettling. He tried to access the email content, but it was gone. They had been thoroughly removed from the server. Someone had been careful to cover their tracks. A noise at the door made him look up. Thomas stood there, watching him with an unreadable expression. "Paul, surprised to see you here on a Saturday." Paul quickly closed the system window, feeling like a teenager caught doing something forbidden. "I was just going over some things for Monday's meeting." Thomas entered and sat in the chair across from Paul's desk. "We need to talk about what happened with Swiss Tech. You're acting strangely, Paul. What's going on?" It was the perfect moment to confront him, to ask about the deleted emails and inconsistencies, but something stopped Paul. He didn't have concrete proof, just suspicions. What if he was wrong? If Thomas was innocent, any accusation would destroy decades of friendship and partnership. "I'm just being cautious about the sale," he replied, avoiding his partner's gaze. "It's the biggest deal we've ever done. We can't afford mistakes." Thomas studied him for a moment, as if trying to read beyond his words. "I understand caution, but we also need to trust our partners. Swiss Tech is getting impatient. If we keep delaying, they might look elsewhere." "Then let them," Paul said more firmly than he intended. "If they can't wait a few weeks for the largest acquisition in their history, maybe they're not the partners we want." Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "As you wish, it is your company after all." "It always has been." There was something in Thomas's tone, maybe a hint of bitterness, that left Paul uneasy. "Your company," he had said, "not our company." A casual slip or a glimpse of hidden resentment. After Thomas left, Paul remained still, absorbing the conversation. Doubt grew like a shadow, slowly consuming the light of trust that once illuminated his professional relationships. His phone buzzed, a message from Lucas Mercier. "Found something in the financial records, notable patterns of transfers to offshore accounts. We need to talk in person. Tomorrow, same place, 9 a.m. Paul put his phone away, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. Part of him still hoped he was wrong, that this was a huge misunderstanding. But another part, increasingly larger, knew he had reached a point of no return. Leaving the building, Paul decided to pass once more by the place where he had found Ethan. Without much hope, he wandered the nearby streets, looking into corners and under awnings where homeless people often sheltered. That was when he saw him, sitting on a park bench, watching pigeons as before. Paul approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. "You disappeared," Paul said as he sat down next to the boy. Ethan shrugged, not seeming surprised by his appearance. "I don't like shelters. Too many rules, too many questions." Paul nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. Ethan was like him in many ways, preferring freedom, despite its risks, over security that came with obligations. "I found some things out," Paul said after a moment's silence, "about what you warned me." "You were right to be concerned." Ethan looked at him with those intense blue eyes again. "It's someone you trust, isn't it? Someone close." "How do you know that?" Paul almost whispered. "I just do," Ethan replied, turning his attention back to the pigeons. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we fail to see clearly." The profound simplicity of that statement hit Paul. For years, he had focused on the horizon, on big goals, losing the ability to see what was right in front of him. "What should I do?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. A successful businessman asking a homeless child for advice. The absurdity of the situation did not escape him. Ethan seemed to consider the question seriously. The truth always comes out, but the longer you wait, the more it costs. As Paul watched the boy, he realized the doubt he felt now was different from the paranoia of the past few days. It was a focused doubt, one that pushed him to act rather than paralyze him. Tomorrow he would learn what Lucas Mercier had found. Then, at last, he would start unraveling the web of lies someone had spun around him. As the last light of day faded on the horizon, Paul and Ethan left the park together. A businessman and a homeless child, bound by circumstances neither could have foreseen, walking side by side through the streets of New York as though following an invisible path toward a truth that promised to be as liberating as it was painful. Early dawn light filtered through the windows of Paul's apartment as he dug through an old cardboard box. He had spent the night awake after his conversation with Lucas Mercier, which confirmed his suspicions. Someone had been systematically siphoning off company funds for nearly 3 years, small amounts at first, increasing gradually once the scheme proved successful. Now, Seated on the floor of his guest room amid yellowed photographs and old documents, Paul searched for answers in his past. The box, unopened for years, contained memories of Moreau Enterprises' early days. He picked up a framed photo, him and Thomas much younger, standing in front of a tiny office space with a makeshift sign, Moreau and Laurent Software Solutions. Confident smiles, long hair, faded jeans. The year was 1992, and they were two newly graduated friends with big dreams and a modest loan. "How did we get here?" he murmured to himself, running a finger across the image. In those early years, they worked 16-hour days, shared sandwiches when money was tight, and celebrated every small contract like a major victory. Thomas had always been the brilliant programmer, while Paul had a knack for sales and strategy. They complemented each other perfectly. Another photograph showed their first team of employees 5 years later. 8 people gathered in a bigger, more professional office. Marie was there, newly hired as an administrative assistant. So young and enthusiastic, she eventually took on more responsibilities until she became his executive secretary and right hand. A worn leather folder caught Paul's eye. Inside was the original partnership agreement he and Thomas had drawn up, with help from a lawyer friend who only charged them a few beers for his services. The terms were simple, an equal split of profits and responsibilities, but there was a handwritten note in the margin. In the event of the partnership's dissolution, intellectual property remains with the original developer. Paul frowned. He had never paid much attention to that clause. At the time, it made sense. Thomas did most of the coding, so it was fair he keep the rights if something went wrong. But now that line seemed to carry a different weight. The company's key patents, the ones Swiss Tech was so interested in, would belong to Thomas if the partnership ended. He sifted through more papers, finding the contract with their first major client, a small accounting firm that needed a custom system. That project had put them on the map, leading to bigger contracts. Claude Renoir joined soon after as a financial consultant. Paul found a photo of him at the 1999 Christmas party, a serious man in a suit, looking out of place among casually dressed programmers. Claude had helped organize the company's chaotic finances during its growth phase and eventually became CFO. Always detail-oriented, always correct, or so Paul had believed. He continued digging, lost in memories. A local newspaper article announced the Innovation Award they had received in 2005. A thank you letter from the mayor of New York for the internship program for disadvantaged youth that the company had set up. Small trophies from company bowling tournaments, concert tickets he'd seen with Thomas, employees' birthday cards. One set of photos caught his attention, the inauguration of the current company headquarters 10 years ago. A triumphant moment, the imposing building symbolized everything they had achieved. In one of the images, Paul was cutting the ceremonial ribbon, surrounded by local dignitaries and the press. Thomas stood a few steps behind him, smiling, but there was something in his eyes that Paul had never noticed before, an expression that now seemed more ambiguous. It was around that time that dynamics began to change. As the company grew, Paul took on more of the CEO role, the public face of the firm, while Thomas focused on the technical side, away from the spotlight. At the time, it seemed natural, a division of labor based on their talents. But had that been the start of some hidden resentment? Paul grabbed the album from the company's 20th anniversary party 4 years ago. The photos showed a grand event at a luxurious hotel, hundreds of guests, emotional speeches. He remembered publicly thanking Thomas for his partnership, but now he realized that for a long time, their partnership had turned into something more hierarchical. The company was called Moreau Enterprises, not Moreau and Laurent. When had that happened? At the back of the album was an envelope with the speech he had prepared for that night. Rereading it now, Paul noticed how many times he referred to himself, my vision, my company, my dream realized. Thomas was almost an afterthought, a valuable contributor, not an equal co-founder. Paul closed the album, a heaviness in his chest. How had he not seen it before? He was so absorbed in his own success story that he missed the subtle shifts in the relationships around him. The toughest question hovered in his mind. If Thomas was behind the embezzlement and attempts to manipulate the sale, was it out of revenge? Did he feel neglected, forgotten, or was it pure greed? And what about Marie and Claude? Marie had been there almost from the start and had witnessed it all. Had she been loyal, or merely waiting for the right moment? Claude, with access to all the finances, did he have a motive to divert funds? Paul picked up a more recent photo, a Christmas dinner from last year. He was at the center, surrounded by smiling executives, a group of people he saw every day, with whom he shared major decisions, to whom he entrusted his legacy. How many of those smiles were genuine? The sun was fully up by the time Paul finally returned the photos and documents to the box. He felt exhausted, but also strangely clearer. The past he was revisiting now had layers of meaning he had never grasped. The empire he built wasn't just the result of his work and vision. It was a collective effort, formed by shared trust, by dreams intertwined with the dreams of others. And at some point on this journey, he started seeing it all as his own exclusive achievement. Perhaps that was the root of the betrayal, less in the cold numbers of the financial spreadsheets, and more in the small fractures in the relationships that held everything together. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Lucas Mercier. "Mr. Moreau, I managed to trace one of the offshore accounts. We need to talk in person. I found something that might identify the person behind the embezzlement." Paul felt his heart race. "I'll be at your office in an hour." Before leaving, he looked once more at the photo of him and Thomas at the start of their journey. Two young men brimming with dreams and mutual trust. Could any sum of money be worth destroying a friendship like that? For him, no. But maybe Thomas's answer was different. With a sigh, he closed the box of memories and prepared to face the present, armed with a new perspective on a past that seemed both distant and yet so present in every decision that had led him to this point. 4 days had passed since Lucas Mercier's revelation, 4 days of investigations, discreet phone calls, and sleepless nights. Paul felt pressure mounting from all sides. Swiss Tech was growing impatient with delays, Thomas was questioning his decisions, and the truth was still murky about who was behind everything. That Thursday afternoon, Paul cancelled all meetings. He couldn't stand looking at familiar faces and wondering which of them was hiding a betrayal. He needed air, distance, something to remind him that there was a world beyond the glass walls of Moreau Enterprises. That was how he ended up driving aimlessly through New York streets until stopping near the park where he last saw Ethan. Without much expectation, he wandered around, checking benches, awnings, the corners where homeless people usually sheltered. To his surprise, he found the boy sitting on the steps of a small public library, flipping through an illustrated book. Paul approached slowly, not wanting to scare him. "Do you like books?" Ethan looked up, showing no surprise at seeing him. "This one has pictures of African animals. I've never seen a real elephant." Paul sat beside him, looking at the open page with a herd of elephants crossing a savanna. "I've seen them once, on a trip to Tanzania. They're even more impressive in person." Ethan's eyes lit up with genuine curiosity. "What do they sound like?" Paul smiled, trying to imitate the sound of an elephant, a comical mix of a trumpet and a deep sigh. Ethan laughed, a bright, surprisingly childlike sound for someone who usually seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I'm hungry," Ethan said simply, closing the book. "Me too. How about a snack?" They walked to a small cafe on the corner. Paul noticed how Ethan moved with the caution of someone used to being invisible, sidestepping people without drawing attention, always on guard. At the cafe, the boy devoured a sandwich and a slice of pie as though he hadn't eaten in days. Which was likely. Paul patiently waited for him to finish before trying to talk. "Have you always lived on the streets?" Ethan took a sip of hot chocolate before answering. "No. I used to live in a small apartment with my dad, but it was our home. He worked a lot. Sometimes I wouldn't see him for days when he had big projects." "What happened to him?" Ethan's expression hardened. "He disappeared. One day he left for work and never came back. I waited alone in the apartment for 3 days, until the landlord came looking for rent and realized I was there by myself. He called social services." Paul felt a knot in his stomach. "How old were you?" 4. That was 2 years ago. 2 years on the streets, bouncing between shelters and social workers, with no one who really cared. Ethan's reality was so far from Paul's that it seemed like another planet, not the same city. And your mom? She died when I was a baby. Dad said she was beautiful and smart. She had blue eyes like mine. Paul looked at those eyes, truly extraordinary in their intensity and color, seeming to carry a wisdom far beyond Ethan's 6 years. Your dad never mentioned any other relatives? Anyone who could take care of you? Ethan shrugged. My mom's family was from Germany. I never met them, and my dad said his parents had died. It was just us two. Do you remember where your dad worked? Ethan furrowed his brow in concentration. It started with an M, I think. He had an access card with a blue and white logo. The Moreau Enterprises logo. Paul felt a chill run through him. It could be a coincidence, of course. There were several tech companies in New York whose names began with M and used blue, but he couldn't shake the feeling there was more to this story. Would you mind spending the afternoon with me? Paul tried to keep his tone casual. We can go to the zoo. They have some African animals there, not elephants, but they do have giraffes and zebras. Ethan's eyes widened. I've never been to the zoo. The afternoon that followed was surprisingly light for Paul. For a few hours, he forgot corporate betrayals, the millions at stake, the constant pressure. Instead, he focused on explaining to Ethan the differences between zebra species, buying him blue cotton candy, just walking alongside a child who marveled at things most kids took for granted. At the primate exhibit, they stopped to watch a gorilla family. The dominant male sat imposingly, while the youngsters played under the mother's watchful eyes. If I had a family like that, I'd never leave, Ethan said quietly. Paul looked at him, noticing the sadness lurking beneath the surface. Do you think your dad left by choice? Ethan was silent for a moment. No. He loved me. I know that. Something bad happened to him. The certainty in the boy's voice was unsettling. Paul placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt both natural and strange. He couldn't recall the last time he had any meaningful physical contact with someone. I promise I'll find out what happened to your dad. The words left his mouth before he could think, but he felt they were the right thing to say. Ethan looked at him with open gratitude. Late in the afternoon, they sat on a park bench, eating ice cream. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees. Where will you sleep tonight? Paul asked. I have a place, Ethan answered vaguely. Paul knew that a place likely meant another awning, another bench, another hidden corner of the city. I have a guest room that's empty. You could stay there. Ethan looked at him warily. Why? The question was simple but profound. Why would a millionaire businessman offer shelter to a homeless kid he barely knew? Paul considered before answering. Because you remind me of something I'd forgotten. What? That life isn't all about business and money. Ethan seemed to measure his sincerity. Just for tonight, he said finally. Tomorrow, I'll go back to the streets. Paul nodded, respecting his terms. On the drive to his apartment, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the small passenger observing the city with wide eyes. Two survivors of the world, Paul thought. One with everything except what truly mattered. Another with nothing yet possessing a clarity Paul lost long ago. Maybe, amid the chaos his life had become, this unlikely bond was exactly what they both needed. The bluish light of the computer monitor was the only illumination in Paul's home office. 3 in the morning, and he was still there, rummaging through digital files, comparing reports, searching for patterns he might have missed before. Ethan slept on the couch in the corner, wrapped in a wool blanket. It had been a week since the boy spent that first night at his apartment, and now it almost felt like he had always been there. Paul rubbed his tired eyes. The final report from Lucas Mercier had arrived the day before, confirming his suspicions that funds had been diverted systematically for almost 3 years. The report also pointed to a likely culprit, but the evidence was circumstantial. Paul needed more. The screen showed a list of Moreau Enterprises employees over the last 5 years. Somewhere in that list was David Fisher, Ethan's father. Paul had promised to investigate and intended to keep his word. His eyes glazed over from so many names until he finally found what he was looking for. David Fisher, senior programmer, hired in March 2017, terminated in May 2023, exactly 2 years ago. Official reason: job abandonment. Paul clicked to open the personnel file. The photo showed a man in his mid-30s, dark hair, intense blue eyes like Ethan's. Performance reviews were stellar, with enthusiastic comments from managers about his technical skill and dedication. Not the type of person to simply walk away from his son. Paul checked who had been David's direct supervisor, Claude Renoir, who at the time was both CFO and acting IT manager. Strange, Paul thought. Claude came from a finance background, not tech. Why would he directly supervise a programmer? In the internal communication records, Paul found multiple emails between David and Claude in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, mostly technical, regarding security updates to the company's financial system. Nothing suspicious at first glance. Paul was about to close the file when he noticed something: an email from David to HR, dated 2 days before he vanished. The subject was simple: concerns about internal procedures. There was no reply, at least officially. Even stranger, there was no body text, only the subject, as if someone had deleted the content but forgotten to erase the record. "What were you trying to report, David?" Paul murmured. A small sound made him turn around. Ethan was awake, watching him with sleepy eyes. "Did you find anything about my dad?" the boy asked, voice husky with sleep. Paul hesitated. He didn't want to give false hope, but he also didn't want to lie. "I found his record in the company. I'm trying to figure out what happened to him." Ethan nodded, as though that was exactly what he expected. He discovered something bad, didn't he? Something he shouldn't have seen. Paul felt a chill. The boy's intuition was unsettling. "Why do you think that?" He was worried those last few weeks. He'd talk on the phone in a low voice, close his computer when I walked into the room. One night, I overheard him saying he couldn't stay quiet. That too much was at stake. Paul turned back to the computer, growing more uneasy by the second. There was definitely a connection here, he was sure of it. David Fisher had discovered the embezzlement. He had tried to alert someone, then he vanished. "Let's get back to sleep, Ethan. We'll keep digging tomorrow." The next morning, Paul arrived early at the office. He had left Ethan in his apartment with Gabrielle, who seemed delighted by the boy's presence. "It's finally bringing some life to this house," she had remarked. His first stop was the IT department. He needed to speak with someone who had worked directly with David Fisher. After a few questions, he found Antoine, an older programmer who had been at the company for over 10 years. "David Fisher? Of course I remember him," Antoine said when Paul asked in private. "One of the best programmers we ever had. We were all shocked when he just stopped showing up. Didn't you find it odd? He didn't seem like the kind of person to abandon a job without explanation." Antoine glanced around, as though checking if anyone could hear. "We did find it odd. David was dedicated, meticulous, and he had a little boy he took care of on his own. Some of us even tried to look for him. We went to the police, but they said it was a voluntary disappearance and there wasn't much they could do." Paul felt his stomach sink. "What was David working on in the weeks before he disappeared?" Antoine hesitated. "He was doing an internal audit of the financial system, a routine check as far as I know, but he started acting strange after that. Seemed nervous, worried. Did he mention finding anything?" "Not directly, but once. He said there were inconsistencies in the records that didn't make sense. I thought he was talking about bugs in the system." Paul thanked Antoine and returned to his office, the puzzle pieces slowly falling into place. He needed to access the specific work David had been doing before he vanished, but he suspected those files wouldn't be easy to find. Instead of confronting Claude or Thomas directly, he decided on another approach. He called Lucas Mercier. "I need you to help me access some security logs from 2 years ago. Specifically, I want to know what a programmer named David Fisher was looking at before he left the company." "That might be tricky, Mr. Moreau. It'd be easier with a warrant." "We don't have time for that, Lucas. I think there's a connection between the embezzlement and this employee's disappearance." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I have a contact in the cybercrime unit. Maybe he can help us quietly. No promises." Paul spent the rest of the morning avoiding Thomas and Claude, claiming he had off-site meetings. Instead, he combed through the physical archives in the company's basement. where older documents were stored. It was there that he found an old folder stamped Project Eagle. He had never heard of this project, which was strange given he knew about all major initiatives. The folder contained technical documents related to financial system security, dated 3 years earlier, right before the start of the fraud Lucas had detected. On the last page was a list of names, the team assigned to the project. David Fisher was there, along with 2 other programmers who had since left, and one surprising name, Thomas Laurent, listed as supervisor. But Thomas hadn't been involved in low-level technical projects for years. Why would he be directly involved here? Paul took photos of the documents with his phone and left discreetly. Returning to his car, he received a message from Lucas. "I found something. Come to my office immediately." When Paul arrived, Lucas Mercier seemed agitated. On his computer screen were logs from Moreau Enterprises' system. "My contact recovered these access records from 2 years ago. Your employee David Fisher was accessing specific financial files in the weeks before he disappeared," Lucas explained, pointing to the screen. More importantly, he copied some of those files to an external device 3 days before he was last seen. "Which files?" "Transaction records for offshore accounts. The same accounts I identified in my investigation, used for the embezzlement." Paul felt a surge of adrenaline. David had discovered the fraud, tried to blow the whistle. Then, "There's more," Lucas continued. "We found logs from the company's main server on the night David Fisher was last seen. Someone using administrative credentials accessed his profile and then deactivated it." "Who?" Lucas turned the screen so Paul could see more clearly. "It was done using Claude Renoir's credentials." Paul felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. "Claude? The always proper, meticulous, loyal Claude Renoir? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. And there's more. I cross-referenced the fraud dates with the logs of who was accessing the financial system. Each time, Claude was logged in. He had the technical knowledge, the access, and the authority to do all this without raising suspicion." Paul recalled years of working with Claude, the man who organized the company's finances, who always seemed dedicated and honest. He had never suspected him. Maybe because Claude stayed in the background, quietly efficient, never seeking the spotlight. "And Thomas?" Paul asked, still reeling. "What's his role in all this?" Lucas frowned. "I found no direct evidence of his involvement, but that doesn't mean he isn't involved. Claude could be acting alone or working for someone," Paul finished. "Exactly. We should be very careful now, gather more evidence before we act." Paul nodded, feeling the weight of a truth that was starting to emerge. "What happened to David Fisher?" he asked quietly. Lucas sighed. "I can't say for sure. All we have are computer logs. But given the circumstances, he might have been silenced," Paul said, feeling a chill at the thought of Ethan, waiting in his apartment for news about his father. On the drive home, Paul navigated in autopilot, his mind swirling with turmoil. The truth was close, but still cloaked in shadows. Claude was clearly guilty of the embezzlement and likely knew what happened to David Fisher. But was he acting alone, or was he just a pawn in a bigger game? When he arrived, he found Ethan and Gabriel sitting at the kitchen table, drawing together. The domestic scene, so different from the chaos he was facing, gave Paul a moment of clarity. "Gabriel, could you leave us alone for a bit?" Once they were alone, Paul sat next to Ethan. "I found out some things about your dad," he said carefully. "He was an honest man, Ethan, and very brave." The boy's eyes, that same intense blue as his father, locked onto Paul's. "What happened to him?" Paul hesitated. How to explain to a 6-year-old that his father had likely discovered fraud and been, fired, threatened? Worse. "Your dad uncovered something wrong at the company where we both worked, something powerful people wanted to keep secret. He tried to do the right thing." Ethan absorbed the words, an age-defying understanding reflected in his gaze. "So he's not coming back, is he?" he asked simply. Paul felt his throat tighten. "I don't know, Ethan, but I promise I'll find out the whole truth, and I'll make sure justice is done." That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Paul spent hours in his office, organizing the evidence he had. He needed a carefully crafted plan. He couldn't just accuse Claude without concrete proof and a strategy to discover if others were involved. He spread a large sheet of paper on his desk and began mapping connections, dates, and proofs. In the center of the diagram, two names, Claude Renoir and David Fisher. Between them, a question mark representing the mystery yet to be fully unraveled. As the night wore on, Paul worked meticulously, analyzing and positioning each piece of information. His businessman's instinct, accustomed to complex negotiations and strategies, was now directed toward a different mission, uncovering a conspiracy that had happened inside his own company, under his own nose. When dawn broke, Paul had a plan. He would be patient, methodical, discreet. He would not confront anyone directly until he had every piece. The truth was close, and he would reach it, no matter how long it took or how painful it might be. For Ethan, for David Fisher, and for everyone who trusted him, Paul would not rest until every shadow was brought into the light of truth. The rain had been pouring non-stop for hours, turning New York streets into liquid mirrors reflecting the city lights. Paul watched the droplets slide down the windows of his office, waiting for the last employee to leave the building. It was nearly midnight on a Friday, and he was finally alone. The past few days had been a delicate dance of appearances. By day, he maintained the facade of normalcy. Meetings, decisions, carefully calculated smiles. In the shadows, he gathered evidence, followed leads, prepared for the decisive moment. Claude Renoir showed no sign of suspicion. He carried on his meticulous work as always, presenting impeccable reports, providing measured financial advice. It was almost surreal for Paul to see this man, now known to be the mastermind behind a million-dollar fraud, acting with such composure. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Moreau, this is Antoine from security. The building is empty, as you requested." "Thanks, Antoine. You can go home." "I'll set the security system myself when I leave." Paul hung up and took a deep breath. It was time. He headed to the finance department, using his access card to enter Claude's office. The place was as impeccably organized as its occupant, almost obsessively neat and nothing out of place. With the information Lucas Mercier had given him, Paul accessed Claude's computer. The CFO was meticulous in nearly every way. But he had one weak point, reusing the same password format across multiple systems, changing only one digit at the end. Lucas had uncovered this pattern. Paul quickly found what he was looking for, a hidden folder containing records of transactions parallel to the official books. For years, Claude had diverted small amounts from various projects, never enough to raise immediate red flags, but cumulatively forming a considerable fortune. But there was more, something Lucas hadn't found. A subfolder simply labeled DF. Paul clicked on it, feeling his heart pound. Inside were dozens of files, all related to David Fisher, saved emails, activity reports, even discreetly taken photos. Claude had monitored David systematically in the months leading up to his disappearance, compiling a virtual dossier. Then came the final blow, an audio file dated the day David disappeared. Paul hesitated before clicking. Part of him didn't want to know, wanted to keep at least a shadow of doubt about what really happened, but it was too late to turn back. The recording began with muffled voices, which then became clear. Claude and David, arguing heatedly. "I know what you're doing," said David's voice, tense but firm. "I found the records of the offshore transactions. You've been diverting money for years." "Impressive," Claude replied, his voice oddly calm. "No one else has noticed. You really are talented, David. I'm going to report this to Paul Moreau. He deserves to know what's happening in his own company." A dry laugh from Claude. "Paul is too busy being the public face to notice anything. Besides, why would he believe you over me?" "Because I have proof." A long silence. Then Claude's voice, now icier. "Think about your son, David, little Ethan. He only has you, right? It would be a shame if something—" "Are you threatening me?" David's voice trembled for the first time. "I'm offering you an alternative. Enough money for both of you to start a new life somewhere else, far from here, far from trouble. I don't want your dirty money." "Then what do you want, David? To be a hero? Heroes rarely live to tell their stories." The recording cut off abruptly. Paul sat frozen, a wave of nausea hitting him. It was worse than he imagined. Not just fraud, Cess, but blackmail, threats, maybe worse. He copied all the files and left quickly, leaving no trace of his presence. The rain had stopped by the time he got home, but the cold he felt came from within. Ethan was asleep in the guest room, which had effectively become his own. Paul stood in the doorway watching the child. In the past few days, he had grown genuinely fond of the boy. It was not just guilt or obligation, it was something deeper, more instinctive. "Why aren't you sleeping?" Ethan asked suddenly, eyes open. Paul smiled slightly. The kid had an uncanny sixth sense. "I was working late." "Go back to sleep." "Did you find anything about my dad?" The direct question caught Paul off guard. He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Maybe. But we should talk in the morning, when we're both rested." Ethan sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "I haven't slept well since he disappeared. I want to know the truth, even if it's bad." Paul entered the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The boy's determination, so similar to his father's, broke through his defenses. "I found evidence your dad discovered wrongdoing in the company. Wrongdoing some powerful people wanted to hide." Ethan nodded slowly. "He was worried in those last weeks, always checking if the windows were locked, if someone was following us. I thought he was imagining things." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" The boy lowered his gaze. "Because it wasn't by chance that I found you that night." Paul felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I'd been following you for days," Ethan confessed. "Ever since I saw your photo in the newspaper talking about the company sale, I recognized the name, Moreau Enterprises. That's where my dad worked." Paul felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Ethan's appearance in his life had a purpose. The boy continued. "My dad left a letter hidden under the floorboards of our apartment. He said if anything happened to him, I should find Paul Moreau. He said you were a good man who would help, but when I finally found you, I got scared. What if you were part of the problem? What if you knew what happened to him?" Tears now slid down Ethan's cheeks. Paul felt a lump in his throat. "That's why you said my future was in danger. You wanted to see my reaction." Ethan nodded. "And also because I really did have that dream. I saw you sad, everything falling apart around you." Paul took a deep breath, absorbing the gravity of the revelation. It hadn't been chance or fate. David Fisher, somehow foreseeing danger, had left a final lifeline for his son and for Paul. "Do you still have that letter?" "No. The landlord threw everything out when we lost the apartment. I tried to go back for it, but it was too late." Paul felt a renewed sense of responsibility. His duty now extended far beyond saving his company. It was about justice for David, a future for Ethan, and making amends for failing to see what had happened right under his nose. "Tomorrow we'll find out exactly what happened to your dad. I promise." The next morning, Paul cancelled all his appointments and took Ethan on a special mission. Their first destination was the boy's old address, a modest building in a middle-class neighborhood. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, looked at them suspiciously. "Apartment 302. "Yeah, it sat empty for a while after that guy disappeared and left rent unpaid. Someone else lives there now." "What about his belongings?" Paul asked. "I stored them for a few months, as required by law. Then I donated what was good and tossed the rest. Were there any documents, important papers?" Paul insisted. The man scratched his head. "Maybe. Can't remember exactly. Waiter, I think I kept one box of papers in the storage room, just in case. You never know when someone might claim it." The storage room was a damp, poorly lit basement. The landlord dug through stacks of forgotten belongings until he found a cardboard box labeled Fisher. "Here you go. Take it, if you really are family." "He's my dad," Ethan said with a firmness that made the landlord step back. Paul thanked the man and generously paid him for the inconvenience, ensuring no further questions. Back in the car, they opened the box eagerly. It contained David's personal documents, birth certificate, college diploma, old contracts, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope addressed to Paul Moreau. With slightly trembling hands, Paul opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Mr. Moreau, if you're reading this, my suspicions were correct, and something happened to me. During the financial system audit, I found significant discrepancies pointing to a systematic embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Mr. Renoir. I tried alerting HR, but my messages were ignored. I gathered concrete evidence and stored it on a drive I've hidden. Only my son knows where it is. Our secret treasure. I ask that you take care of Ethan if I can no longer do it. He is all I have, and I fear the people involved in this scheme won't hesitate to use my son against me. I trust your integrity, even though I've never met you personally. David Fisher. Paul looked at Ethan, who had read the letter with him. The secret treasure. Do you know where it is? Ethan nodded slowly. In the park near our home. There's a big tree with a hollow trunk. We used to hide things there. It was our game. The park was small but well maintained. Ethan ran straight to an old oak in the far corner. Paul watched as the boy reached into a natural opening in the trunk, and after a few seconds, pulled out a small object wrapped in waterproof plastic. A flash drive. Back at Paul's apartment, they connected it to the computer. It was password protected. Try your birthday, Paul suggested. Ethan typed in the dates, but no luck. What about your dad's birthday? Nothing. Wait, Ethan suddenly said, try secret treasure. It worked, and the drive opened, revealing dozens of meticulously organized files. David had been thorough, documenting every suspicious transaction, every strange movement. There were screenshots, comparative spreadsheets, even recorded conversations. All pointed to Claude Renoir as the mastermind behind the years-long scheme. But there was also something unexpected, occasional references to an unidentified partner, someone Claude consulted for major decisions. Among the files was a video. It showed David recording himself in his apartment. He appeared tense, frequently glancing off camera as though checking the door or window. My name is David Fisher. I work as a senior programmer at Moreau Enterprises. I'm recording this testimony because I fear for my safety. I've discovered a systematic embezzlement scheme carried out by CFO Claude Renoir. I have compiled all the evidence onto this drive, 518. If anything happens to me, this information should be given to CEO Paul Moreau and to law enforcement. I also note that if I disappear or am found dead, Claude Renoir should be the primary suspect. 519. Ethan, if you ever see this, know that I love you more than anything. Everything I did was for a better world for you. The video ended with David looking directly at the camera, those same penetrating blue eyes his son inherited. Paul and Ethan remained silent for a long moment, both processing what they had just discovered. We need one more piece, Paul finally said. We need to know exactly what happened to your dad. Their next stop was the police station. Paul used his influence to gain access to the file on David's disappearance. The detective who assisted them seemed surprised by the sudden interest in a closed case. There wasn't much to investigate, he explained, flipping through the thin folder. A single man. No signs of violence in his home, no suspicious bank movements. All indications pointed to a voluntary disappearance. Cases like that are more common than you'd think. But he had a 4-year-old son, Paul insisted. What kind of father abandons his child voluntarily? The detective frowned, reassessing the file. That's not listed in the initial report. Were social services involved? I'm the one who called, said a voice behind them. An older officer approached, his face lined by decades of service. I remember that case. Fisher, right? I got an anonymous tip about a child left alone at that address. When we arrived out, it was just the boy alone for a few days. We called social services, but we couldn't find the father or any relatives. Didn't you think that was suspicious? Paul asked, frustration clear in his tone. The officer shrugged. Look, we don't have the resources to dig into every single abandonment case, especially when there's no obvious sign of a crime. What if I told you I have evidence he was threatened before he disappeared? That caught the police's attention. In the following minutes, Paul explained the situation, omitting only the fact that he had proof directly implicating Claude. The detective typed rapidly into his computer. There's an update here that wasn't added to the physical file. A body was found in the Hudson 6 months after Fisher disappeared, partially decomposed, so conclusive identification was impossible at the time. But the DNA was preserved. We can compare it to Ethan's, Paul said, looking at the boy who stood stoically by his side, taking in every word with impressive maturity. 3 days later, the confirmation arrived like a silent blow. The body in the river was David Fisher. The cause of death listed as undetermined, with notes on possible injuries consistent with violence prior to immersion. Paul watched Ethan absorb the news in his apartment. The boy did not cry. Maybe he already knew, somehow, that his father wouldn't return. "What happens now?" Ethan asked after a long silence. Paul sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Now we seek justice. For your dad, for you, for everyone who got hurt." As Ethan finally allowed himself to cry, clinging to Paul, the reality hit him with devastating clarity. The scheme that almost ruined his company began long before he realized, and the person who betrayed him likely bore responsibility not only for corporate crimes but also for Ethan's father's tragic fate. And for the first time since this all began, Paul saw it wasn't just about saving his company or his reputation. It was about rebuilding a world that had collapsed for a child who, against all odds, had found his way to him when they both needed it most. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders, but it also drove him forward. For Ethan, for David, and for the man he wanted to be, Paul would face whatever came next, no matter how painful. The top-floor conference room at Moreau Enterprises was silent, lit only by the soft glow of the setting sun through the panoramic windows. Paul carefully arranged the documents on the dark wooden table, double-checking everything was in order. The past few weeks had been intense. Secret meetings with investigators, nights poring over files, pieces of a dark puzzle finally fitting together. He glanced at the clock, 6:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, everyone would be there for what he had called an urgent strategic meeting about the company sale. But only Paul knew the meeting's true purpose. Ethan was at his apartment with Gabrielle. Paul had considered letting him attend, but decided to spare him from the confrontation. The boy had been through enough trauma already. The door opened and Thomas Laurent entered, looking tense. "Paul, are we really going through with this sale? After everything that's happened?" Paul kept his expression neutral. "There's a lot to discuss today, Thomas. Let's wait for the others." One by one, the others arrived. Claude Renoir, impeccable as always in his grey suit, Marie, with her usual notepad, Philippe Dubois, the lawyer, and finally, Inspector Leblanc from the Major Crimes Division, whose presence caused surprised, confused looks. "Thank you all for coming," Paul began, remaining standing. "This isn't a meeting about the sales, as you might guess from Inspector Leblanc's presence. We're actually here to discuss a series of crimes committed within Moreau Enterprises over the past few years." A heavy silence filled the room. Claude adjusted his tie, an almost imperceptible sign of discomfort. Thomas frowned, looking genuinely puzzled. "In recent months, I've discovered evidence of systematic embezzlement of company funds, document tampering, and possibly something much worse, the disappearance and death of an employee who threatened to expose these activities." Paul opened a folder and placed a photo on the table. David Fisher, a senior programmer, disappeared 2 years ago. His body was found in the Hudson 6 months later, showing signs of violence. Thomas swallowed hard, looking at the photo. "What does that have to do with us, Paul? It was a closed police case, as far as I know." "It has everything to do with us, Thomas. David discovered financial irregularities in our company. He tried to report them, and he paid with his life." Paul then laid out the documents found with Ethan, the meticulously compiled evidence by David, suspicious transactions, emails, recordings. All of this points to a long-term, carefully planned embezzlement scheme carried out by someone with privileged access to our finances. Everyone's eyes instinctively turned to Claude, who remained expressionless. "And recently," Paul continued, "that same person tried to manipulate the company's sale to Swiss Tech, inserting clauses that would allow him to continue the scheme even after the acquisition." Finally, Claude spoke, his voice controlled. "Are you accusing me, Paul?" "Based on documents found by some homeless kid. I'm accusing you based on forensic evidence, testimonies, bank records, and your own negligence in hiding your digital tracks," Paul replied, opening another folder. "Inspector Leblanc has a warrant for your arrest, Claude." The silence that followed was shattered by an unexpected laugh. It came not from Claude, but from Thomas. "Ever so meticulous and direct, aren't you, Paul?" Thomas said, shaking his head. "That's why you were able to build all this. You focus on the obvious, while ignoring what lurks in the shadows." Paul felt a chill. There was something in Thomas's voice he'd never heard before. "What are you talking about, Thomas?" Thomas leaned back, suddenly relaxed, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Claude is guilty, of course. He diverted the funds, tampered with the documents, even confronted Fisher that night. But do you really think he acted alone? That he had the strategic vision to plan all this?" Claude looked at Thomas, his mask of indifference finally cracking. "You promised—" "I promised to protect you if you followed my instructions to the letter," Thomas interrupted coldly. "But you failed, didn't you? You left clues, got too nervous when that nosy programmer started asking questions." Paul stared in disbelief, the reality rearranging itself before his eyes. "Thomas, all this time, it was you." Thomas smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "You renamed the company Moreau Enterprises. You didn't even keep our name. Remember that original contract we signed? In the event of partnership dissolution, intellectual property remains with the original developer. I wrote the code that launched this company, but who got the glory? Who became the face of the company? Who made all the major decisions without consulting me?" The revelation hit Paul like a physical blow. Thomas, his oldest friend, his partner from the start. "So this is about resentment, wounded pride." "It's about justice," Thomas replied, his voice thick with long-held bitterness. "You systematically shut me out of important decisions, relegated me to a secondary role in the company we built together. The money was just a bonus. What I really wanted was to reclaim control of what we created." Claude looked increasingly anxious. "Thomas, this wasn't the plan. You said we'd just recover what was yours by right, without involving—" "Shut up," Thomas snapped. "You're just an accountant with privileged access, easily replaced. I'm the architect of this entire operation." Inspector LeBlanc, who had been silently observing, finally intervened. "Mr. Laurent, are you confessing to involvement in the financial crimes and the death of David Fisher?" Thomas shot the inspector a scornful look. "Death? I never ordered anyone to be killed. Claude was only supposed to scare him, make him drop the accusation. Whatever happened after that was Claude's initiative." Claude jumped up from his chair, agitated. "That's a lie. You told me to resolve the problem for good. What did you think that meant?" "It meant bribing him, threatening him, maybe even framing him," Thomas replied. "It did not mean killing him and leaving a child orphaned." Claude's face reddened with anger. "You knew exactly what would happen. Fisher wouldn't take a bribe. He was too honest. You pushed me, said everything was at risk, that I'd be exposed too if he talked." Paul watched the accusations fly back and forth in growing horror. The truth was worse than he had imagined. Not only corporate fraud and obstruction of justice, but manipulation, conspiracy, a man dead, a child's life destroyed. "Enough," Paul interrupted, voice trembling with contained anger. "Both of you will face justice for every crime you committed. And I will personally make sure you pay for what you did to David Fisher and his son," Inspector LeBlanc signaled, and two police officers waiting outside entered the room. "Claude Renoir, Thomas Laurent, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, document tampering, and obstruction of justice," announced the inspector. "You will be held in custody while we investigate your involvement in David Fisher's death." As the officers handcuffed the two men, Thomas looked directly at Paul. "You know what your mistake was, Paul. Confusing success with deserving. You really believed you deserved all this more than I did." Paul held his gaze. "My mistake was trusting you blindly, Thomas. It was forgetting that a partnership only works with mutual respect. But your mistake was far greater. You betrayed not just me, but yourself and everything we built together." As the police led Thomas and Claude away, the room fell into a heavy silence. Marie seemed shocked. Philippe scribbled furiously, processing the legal repercussions of everything he'd just witnessed. "We'll need formal statements from everyone," said Inspector LeBlanc. "And you, Mr. Moreau, will have to answer many questions in the coming days." Paul nodded, feeling the weight of the events bearing down on him at last. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure justice is served. When everyone left, Paul remained alone in the conference room, gazing at the New York skyline through the windows. The city had begun turning on its lights, golden dots in the twilight. So many intertwined lives, so many stories unfolding at once, most invisible to each other. Like David Fisher's, who died trying to do the right thing, like Ethan's, forced to survive on the streets with no one to protect him, like Thomas's, consumed by resentment that grew in the shadows over years, turning friendship into betrayal. Paul picked up his phone and called home. "Gabriel, how's Ethan?" "He's fine, sir. We just finished dinner. He asked about you. Tell him I'm on my way, and that I have news about his dad." On his way home, Paul tried to organize his thoughts. How would he explain to a 6-year-old that his father had been killed for trying to do the right thing? How would he talk about betrayal, greed, and justice without destroying the little faith Ethan might still have in humanity? When he reached the apartment, he found Ethan waiting anxiously in the living room. "Did you find out who hurt my dad?" he asked immediately. Paul sat next to him on the sofa, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, Ethan. And they were arrested today. They won't be able to hurt anyone again." "Was it the man my dad was afraid of? The one he always talked to in a low voice?" "Yes, he was involved, but there was someone else too, someone who gave him orders." Ethan's eyes, so much like his father's, bored into Paul's with that same unsettling intensity. "Did they admit it? Did they say what they did to him?" Paul hesitated, but decided Ethan deserved the truth, adapted to what he could understand. They argued with each other, trying to blame one another. "But what matters is we have proof now, and they'll be punished by law." Ethan took it all in silently, then, to Paul's surprise, suddenly hugged him. It was a tight, desperate embrace, as though he were finally allowing all the bottled-up pain to flow out. "Thank you," the boy whispered through sobs. "My dad was right about you." Paul embraced him back, feeling the small shoulders shake with tears. Something changed in him at that moment, a profound and irreversible transformation. All his corporate achievements, his wealth, his prestige, none of it compared to making a real difference in the life of a child who had suffered so much. In the days that followed, while the case unfolded publicly, Thomas and Claude in pre-trial detention, the company undergoing a thorough audit, newspapers speculating on the scandal's details, Paul made a life-changing decision. One quiet afternoon, as he watched Ethan do homework at the kitchen table, he had recently enrolled in a regular school, Paul sat next to him. "Ethan, have you thought about the future? About where you'd like to live permanently?" The boy looked up from his math worksheet. "I like it here. It's quiet, and you have lots of books." Paul smiled. "I've been thinking, what if you stayed here for good? With me?" Ethan frowned, giving the question his characteristic serious thought. "Like a real family. Exactly like a real family. I would be your legal guardian, and eventually, if you wanted, we could talk about adoption. You'd be my dad." The simplicity of the question affected Paul deeply. "I'd never replace your biological father, Ethan. David will always be your dad, and we'll keep his memory alive. But yes, I'd be a second father to you, someone who'd always be by your side, taking care of you, helping you grow." Ethan thought for a moment, his young face serious and contemplative. "I think my dad would like that. He used to say, 'Families can have different shapes.'" Paul felt a lump in his throat. "Your dad was a very wise man." That night, after Ethan went to bed, Paul began outlining a new idea. Inspired by his experience with the boy and horrified by how easily children like him fall through the cracks, he planned a foundation. It wouldn't just be another charity to ease his social conscience. It would be a concrete project to help vulnerable kids, offering not just temporary shelter, but quality education, psychological support, and real future opportunities. The David Fisher Foundation would start in New York, but Paul already envisioned expanding to other cities, even other countries. He would use his fortune, his contacts, and his influence for something truly meaningful. As for Moreau Enterprises, he decided not to sell. After the dust settled and investigations concluded, he would reorganize the company, creating a more transparent and ethical structure. A portion of the profits would be permanently allocated to the foundation, linking his corporate past to his new purpose. In court, months later, Paul testified against his former friends and colleagues. He saw Claude Renoir admit to killing David Fisher in exchange for a reduced sentence. He heard Thomas Laurent, still arrogant despite overwhelming evidence, deny knowledge of the murder, though he admitted orchestrating the financial fraud. Ethan did not attend the trial. Paul insisted on sparing the boy that final chapter, allowing him to begin forming new, brighter memories. When the sentences were finally handed down, 17 years for Claude on homicide and financial charges, 12 years for Thomas as the fraud ringleader, Paul felt no triumph or vengeance, only a deep sadness at the waste of potential, talent, and life. Leaving the courthouse for the last time, with the case finally over, Paul found Ethan waiting on the sidewalk, holding Gabriel's hand. "Is everything settled?" the boy asked. Paul nodded. "It's all settled. Now we can move on." Ethan smiled, a rare, precious grin that lit up his whole face. "Where are we going now?" Paul took the boy's small hand in his own. "Home to Ethan. We're going home." And as they walked together under the New York sun, Paul realized that after decades building his company, he had finally found something infinitely more valuable, a higher purpose, a chance at redemption, and the kind of genuine human bond no amount of business success could ever provide. A family.